Okay, so I gotta do things a little bit differently. I promise I will get going on my lovely, beautiful prezzies. But for now, so I can get you guys some more information, some more visuals, kind of talk you through these little lessons. I'm actually gonna take you through these lessons that you're gonna see in your course, okay? So I'm not going to touch on every little detail, but maybe as you're listening, maybe if you're a good multitasker, you can actually listen and kind of read. But I want you in order to look at the diagrams, I'm just going to tell you guys a little bit about what this is talking about. So this one in particular is about hair and fibers, okay? That is another form of evidence, again, that is used ever so widely, okay, in the crime scene investigation. So when we look at a particular hair, I'm just going to give you kind of the background of what the hair is. So if you look here, this would be like, say this is your arm, this is the skin of your arm right here. This portion that is sticking up out of the skin that you can see, that actually you can feel, that's the shaft, okay? Within this part, the shaft that you can actually see, there are actually 3 layers of it. So if you were to do a cross section, you would be able to see these layers, but the cuticle is the outermost region. That's what that's pointing to right there. The cuticle is made up of many different cells made of keratin. They're very hard, they're very resilient. That's why our hair obviously goes through a lot when it comes to wind, sun, all the different environmental changes, and it's pretty good to go. So that's due to that cuticle. Also, it's very, it kind of keeps water out. We call it hydrophobic, okay? There's also an inner cavity called the medulla. That's actually pointing down here, but it goes throughout the entire hair. And sometimes, it depends on the person, but sometimes that cavity is filled or not filled. Sometimes it's a consistent little tube. Sometimes it's kind of, spotted where you can see like little parts. I'll show you a picture coming up. But that's the big portion of the hair that you can see as far as the shaft is concerned. Now under here is called the follicle. The follicle, basically from your skin down, okay, is where kind of that hair growth occurs. And I know a lot of this isn't necessarily like super pertinent when it comes to evidence, but as someone who might be investigating these fibers in the hairs, you want to know a little bit more about the actual hair. So within the hair follicle, you have glands that secrete oil. That's what keeps your hair kind of not so brittle, so it doesn't break off. You have different things in here that actually there's a muscle, it's not shown here, but the muscle that causes you to have goosebumps. So anyways, there's a lot of different things. I'm not going to go into all those in depth, but a lot of different things that come into the hair, okay? And you can read a little bit more here, but that's a little bit about the hair in general. Now, there are different things about hair growth, and why I'm going to touch on this is because, think about it, if a crime scene investigator or criminalist or forensic scientist is using hair as an evidence, we have to know kind of when sometimes it falls out, why it might fall out. Maybe it's been pulled out. So there are 3 phases here, and you can see the Antigen phase is the first one. This is where most of our hair is always constantly in. It's in that growth, okay? So it says 80 to 90% of the hairs in your body are in that stage. They're constantly growing. But then you reach the Cuticle phase, okay? That slows the growth phase down. So basically, the first stage could last up to 6 years, depending. Okay, this next stage, only 1 to 3 weeks, where the growth is starting to slow down. Okay, so if you guys didn't know, by the way, your hair will stop growing at some point. 6 years if you never cut it. But then the telogen phase is basically where it stops growing altogether, and you're going to shed that hair. Okay, so it says a few months into this phase, the hair will be shed. So basically, here's some pictures of it. So it says phases of the hair growth. Here's the anagen, okay, normal hair where it's growing, la 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 la, and then all of a sudden you have it start to separate from the papillae, okay, and that's kind of where it starts to slow down the growth. And then the last one, the telogen, is basically where it's this resting phase, and it's very easy to fall out and shed at this point, okay? So, good to know that, because obviously when we find hair, we definitely need to know, we don't need to know the phase, but we need to know why it's shed. Maybe it was pulled out, maybe it was shed, just depending on that whole nature, that could play a little part in the evidence role, okay? So how hairs are used as evidence? Well, there are a lot of different things that criminals or criminalistics kind of really target when we look at hairs and fibers. And one of the big things is determining where that hair came from. Was it I think it talks about it over here, is the hair human or animal? Okay, because maybe if there was an animal hair on somebody, and there was some kind of a a witness that said, hey, this person could be a suspect, and that suspect has a dog that matches that, that could be an indication. Also, it could be an indication of the actual suspect, because if you actually get that hair ripped out and that follicle is a part of it, you actually have cells in that follicle that are basically dividing cells that you can grab that DNA and do that DNA analysis from, and possibly get a match in that suspect from just a hair. So it depends. I mean, it has, obviously you have to have that follicle. But also, let me read through these other things. If the hair is human, from what region did it originate? So you want to know maybe if it's the head, the pubic area, the body, the eyes, because that can also help determine that crime scene reconstruction. Okay, if you know what area of the body. Sometimes it can be associated with race. Okay, different races have different types of hair genetically, so that's some indication. And then, is it male or female? Sometimes you can understand if it's a male or female from that DNA analysis and check out if you can pick out those sex chromosomes within the DNA. So there's some big reasons and ways that hair is used for evidence. Kind of important, right? Right. Okay, so what features do forensic scientists examine? So remember I told you guys about that medulla cavity, okay? Where basically it's that inner portion. Sometimes it's filled, a filled cavity. Sometimes it's empty and hollow. So when we look at a human hair shaft, you can see up close if you have a microscope, which obviously all these criminalists will be using. But they will be noting the different things. Here's the cuticle. Here's the cortex, which is not so much the inner region, but then the medulla. This one is basically not a cavity that is continuous. It's kind of spotted when you get up close, and you can see from a distance. You can see these medulla cavities are kind of sporadic. Okay, well you can use a comparison microscope from maybe a suspect's hair to the hair that's found and see if there's any some of the same similarities. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And then you look at a horsehair, and this is the medulla cavity, which is much thicker and it's continuous. Okay, so obviously you can figure out some differences with animals versus humans. Okay, those are some of the things that are examined by those forensic scientists. Also, the shape of the cuticle scales. Okay, so remember the cuticle is that outer most layer of the hair, and it's the protective layer, and it looks very different in different animals. A human, it almost looks like, to me it looks like tree bark. It's kind of layered in a way, but they're very uneven, not symmetrical cells that make up human hair shafts. When you look at a cat hair, it actually looks kind of cool, it looks pretty, but there's a lot of symmetry involved. So each animal has kind of a particular look on their cuticle, and what those cells look like. Okay, so obviously you can look under a microscope, and typically you're using an SEM microscope, which is a scanning electron microscope, not the microscopes that maybe you guys have used in high school. Those aren't powerful enough, but what happens is these basically beam all these electrons, and you're able to see a much clearer picture of what's going on here. All right, so moving on. Now, when we talk about what part of the body did the hair come from, again, that can help with that crime scene investigation. I'm not going to go over these in detail. You guys can read through these, but there's differences in each of the hairs. I mean, look at this picture. This is eyelash hair. First of all, it looks really grody, but nonetheless, they're a little bit thicker, a little bit coarser than head hair. So it can help to, if you find an eyelash or a bunch of eyelashes and you find something else, it might help reconstruct that crime scene. I hate to be gross, but when you think about pubic hairs, then you know that maybe something, in the sexual assault was going on. So all of these things are really important in order to try and find what's going on. So again, here's the eyelash hair, the head hair, quite a difference. Very smooth shaft, the cuticle is very smooth. So anyways, those are some differences. So forensic scientists will definitely pay attention to where in the body this was found, originated. Okay, so some of the class characteristics. Now remember, I was telling you guys that maybe you could even figure out races or ethnicities because, typically there are some patterns found in Europeans, in Africans, and Asians. So it's kind of interesting that you can, also find out whether or not someone was a male or female just from their hair because of those follicle cells. Okay, so that can be a huge indication of some evidence that might be pointing towards, is this person the actual, criminal? Can we convict this person due to hair? And you guys will, when you guys go through this lesson, I skipped over it because I want you guys to read through it, but there is a case, and each, I feel like each unit there's a case presented that this particular lesson that we're talking about with hair and fibers is what actually convicted somebody of a pretty massive crime, okay? All right, so hairs can be examined chemically. Here's another interesting thing. So back in the day, so this guy is Napoleon Bonaparte, and back in the day when they used to use arsenic as poisoning a lot, or as poison, one of the ways they found out they could find out if someone was poisoned by arsenic or poison in general was examining the hair follicle, because it says hair can absorb chemicals from the skin. So if there's chemicals within your body, believe it or not, you can find it in your hair, in those follicles. So they would use this NAA, a neutron activation analysis. So again, it bombards these high energy neutrons, okay, and basically into that sample, causes it to be radioactive. Interesting, right? But then it is going to emit energy, and then you can actually pinpoint what element, what is present in that sample. So that's kind of a cool thing. So they were able to figure out that this guy was in fact poisoned by arsenic because they found it in those hair follicles, okay? Other things have been able to be found too. I think traces of drugs and other types of chemicals that maybe, was part of the crime, okay? Kind of interesting, right? All of our little high-tech gadgets. Okay, so the last thing, actually, I'm going to talk to you about just a couple more things, but not just hairs are examined. Clothing and other types of things that have fibers are also examined. So even carpet fibers or fibers from clothing, things that you can see, which would be very hard to see, but those forensic scientists can gather that evidence, but you can also analyze different fibers. It doesn't have to be just hair. So different fibers, depending on where they are from, are shaped differently. You can use a comparison microscope to compare those two fibers from maybe the actual evidence from a sample that maybe they're comparing it to see if this is the exact same thing. So let's talk about a little bit of difference in some of these. So we have plant and animal fibers. Animal fibers might be, hair, wool, you name it. So we see a similar cuticle. This actually looks similar to almost like the cat, but this is a wool fiber. So still that cuticle with those cells. But then cotton, very smooth. So when we talk about plant fibers, typically they're a lot more smooth. You don't see those coarse cuticles. So, again, this stuff does help in reconstructing that crime. If that's found in the crime scene, you can start to figure out what was going on here, okay? So the last page just kind of talks about the cross-sections and what they might look like. So when you think of synthetic fibers, those could be a lot of different clothing types where fibers could be left on a victim and used as evidence. And there's different shapes. So you can have circular, kind of a cross-section with nylon, polyester. Acrylic and spandex might give kind of a dog bone look. You have collapsed tubes, you have this, all these different shapes that can kind of help to say, all right, let's try and match these up with maybe one of our suspects. They have this clothing, our article of clothing that has the same type of fiber. So it's just to kind of aid in more of the evidence, right? You guys can kind of catch that drift. So make sure you guys read through this lesson on your own, because I didn't touch on every single detail, but it gives you guys a good start for what's in here, what to expect, how criminalistics involves the use of analyzing fibers and hair. So there you have it.